Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Tracy Rosenthal. I'm the Associate Director of the Bernstein Center for Leadership and Ethics at Columbia Business School. And I am excited to welcome you to our first Organizational Leadership Series event of the semester, featuring a conversation with John Flint, former CEO of HSBC and current CEO of the UK Infrastructure Bank, and Leland Kutay, one of CBS's amazing second-year MBA candidates. Today's program is a featured event of the Rubin Mark Initiative, which leverages the intellectual capital of Columbia Business and Law Schools to teach the leadership skills necessary to create an optimal organizational culture. Mr. Rubin Mark, the former CEO of Colgate-Palmolive for more than 25 years, was one of the first leaders to focus on the importance of corporate culture, and we are grateful for his support and to have him in the audience today. At this time, it is my pleasure to introduce today's moderator. Before business school, Leland worked in private equity and investment banking at Gridiron Capital and Barclays, which makes him the perfect person to ask the hard-hitting questions this afternoon. Before handing it over to Leland, a quick reminder to send questions for John through the Q&A box, which will be monitored throughout the event. Thank you so much for joining us, everyone, and I hand it over to you, Leland.
Thanks, Tracy. I'm really excited to be here today with an amazing guest, John Flint. John has had an impressive career, spending 30 years with HSBC, starting the graduate training program, and most recently, their group chief executive. Through his time at HSBC, John represented the company in 9 different countries, spending most of his time in Asia. John held the roles of, get ready for it, group treasurer, deputy head of global markets, chief executive of HSBC Asset Management, and chief executive of retail banking and wealth management before being appointed group chief executive and chairman of HSBC. John is currently chief executive of the UK Investment Bank, a British infrastructure bank, a British state-owned investment bank. Their goal is to help with the UK government's plan to reach net zero carbon by 2050 and to support economic growth in regional and local sectors across the UK. John, thank you so much for joining. How are we doing today?
Hey, Leland, it's a pleasure to be here. I'm very grateful to have this opportunity to have the discussion this morning.
We're excited to have you. So before I hit some of those hard-hitting questions that Tracy mentioned, let's start with a softball here to get us started. Help us to get you know a little bit better. How would your closest friends and family describe you in just a few words?
My closest friends would describe me as quiet, disciplined, and loyal, I think.
Okay, I like that. Well, then let's move right on to some kind of, what did you do in college, graduate school? Were you in any leadership positions? What did you like to do outside the classroom, since we have a number of students on right now?
Yeah, I did have some leadership roles, I guess, at school and at college, and they were always something of a surprise when they came to me. I never sought them, but people would occasionally ask me to lead this or be head of that, captain of various sports teams, etc. So I started my leadership journey pretty young, but I always remember being slightly surprised and wondering why people were asking me to do it. And I don't think at that age I saw myself as having any kind of leadership qualities. I think, when I reflect back on my own character and how that played into my career, the one thing I will share with people today is I spent a lot of time as a kid swimming. And the reason that I think that's relevant to this conversation is that the accepted wisdom when I was a kid was that I was a good swimmer and I had some kind of talent. What I can now tell you with the wisdom of age, knowing myself a little better, is that I was a deeply introverted kid, and I used to love swimming because it was quiet. I could hide in the water. I could get away from the noise of being a kid at school, etc. So I ended up being quite a good swimmer, but that's because I was hiding in the water. And I put that down at the start of the conversation because there can be a presumption that if you want to progress through to leadership, you need to be the classic extrovert. And that's not always the case. So a lot of my misspent youth was spent in a swimming pool.
Well, thanks for sharing that, John. I think we'll definitely get into some of that later. I think it's a good story to start with here. So let's dive right into some time. You spent 30 years with HSBC. I think that's something a lot of the students and executives that we all have on the call today just can hardly imagine. You first started in 1989 as a graduate trainee Can you give me a little career mode, roadmap that explains where you are today? Major challenges and successes, welcome.
Sure. So I think that the first thing to say is I joined an organization that was quite unusual even back in the late 80s, in that it expected its officers, we were called officers when we joined, it expected us to commit a working lifetime to them. On my induction day, they said, we will look after you for the next 30 years, and then you'll have a decent pension if you look after us. So there was an expectation right from the very start that there was a cradle to grave kind of attitude towards employment. And it was a little bit like the British Civil Service or the British Foreign Office in many ways. So I started out on that program. I wanted to travel, I wanted to be a banker, and I liked learning. And the HSBC way of developing its staff suited me. Some people preferred a lot more ownership for their career, and I was very happy just to work from assignment to assignment, learning and building up skills. So I never had a career plan. And a lot of people find that a bit amusing. I started in the graduate program, I left HSBC as a chief executive, but I never had a career plan. I always had something else I wanted to learn. I always had a sense for, after this is finished, I'd like to explore this or learn that. But I never had a career plan. And occasionally that would drive HR a little bit nuts. They would sit me down and say, what do you want to be when you grow up? And I would always frustrate them by saying, well, I don't think that way. Just, I've got a really interesting job now. Let me do that. And then show me something else interesting. Show me else something else interesting, and I'll pursue that. So no career plan. And then probably the last thing I'll leave for people listening in this question is, a lot of my career highlights, or the moments in my career that proved to be an uplift or an acceleration, came from setbacks. They came from crises or even moments of personal failure. So there's a tendency, I think, at the start of your career to think that a career is a straight line. It's a steady progression upwards. That was not my experience at all. Sometimes those tougher moments, those crucible moments, provide the experience that gets you to the next level. And I think that can be helpful for people to understand, because those crucible moments are coming, whether you want them or not. You just don't always know when. They can be a really good thing. In my career, they were great.
Would you chalk those up to kind of taking more risks in your career than otherwise? If you had not taken those risks, do you think, or is it just kind of they just happened and you have to kind of react to them as they come at you?
That's a great question. I think it's a mix of lots of different things. So when I reflect back, when I had career choices to make, I did typically choose, for want of a better term, the scariest option. I did try and stretch myself the most and volunteer for the assignment that would be the most challenging and where I would learn the most. And that approach served me well. So that would explain some of it. But a lot of it, Leland, is down to luck. It's being in the right place at the right time, or the right place at the wrong time, depending on how you look at it. I was the treasurer for the bank in Indonesia during the Asian financial crisis, which was a very intense and stressful time. But at a reasonably young age, because I was probably my late 20s then, I learned how a banking system really worked, because I was part of a banking system that failed. The Indonesian banking system failed and was rescued by the IMF. And if you really want to understand how a piece of the economy works, be in it when it fails. Now, no one else was treasurer of the bank in Indonesia during that period. It was just me. So there were moments of luck. And I think when I look backwards, yes, some of those defining moments I might attribute to decisions I made to put me in the right place. But frankly, a lot of it was also down to just good fortune.
Well, I think that's probably good for a lot of people to hear. I know that I don't know if I know what I want to do when I grow up, and to know that you don't have to have an X on the end of the treasure map at this stage it's heartening. So appreciate that, John.
So actually, just let me finish on that, or just round off the thought on that one. So I would encourage people to have a learning map rather than a career map. right? So just there are so, for bright, curious people today, there are so many different challenges to explore. I would map out those challenges that I wanted to be involved in and that I wanted to learn. And I think if you do that, you probably find that your career will take care of itself. If you get hung up on career and titles and grades and promotions, I think that can be pretty dispiriting. So go for a learning map.
Makes a lot of sense. Thanks, John. How would you describe yourself as a boss?
Wow.
I told you we'd start with the hard-hitting ones.
Well, I'm the wrong person to be asking that, but let me have a go. As a boss, I think, again, disciplined, diligent, detail-oriented, increasingly curious about human behavior. The more I see of it, the more I want to understand it. And I think I would probably have to round it off by saying it takes a while to get to know me, I think. I don't really do good first impressions often. I'm a little bit awkward, and it takes a while for people to get to know me. But yeah, underneath that, the discipline and diligence thing is the thing that people would probably normally come back to as a descriptor.
Well, people at HSBC did have 30 years to get to know you, so
That's right.
So on that topic, you took over HSBC at a very interesting time in the wake of that. I know I'm going to butcher this Huawei ban, and also a few years after record sanctions involving the Mexican drug cartel. Can you tell us what it was kind of like to step in during this era?
Well, I think the first thing to say is, any leadership role, any chief executive role for a large international company, the time's always complicated. We all have our different eras, we all have our different versions. And actually, I would say, my predecessor did an amazing job, and he handed the group over to me in pretty good shape. And the deferred prosecution agreement with the US DOJ, we negotiated our way through that. So when I became chief executive, that was behind us. The geopolitical tensions that exist between the West and the East, they're a constant. If you have a leadership role in HSBC, you have to learn to navigate that. You have to learn the ambiguities and the frustrations that can come with that. We're a guest in every. We like to say that we were a guest in every country. And as a guest, you have to play by the rules of every country. And if at a geopolitical level, those countries are not seeing eye to eye, that can create moments of tension or awkwardness. It's manageable. We managed. You have to put some energy into it. You have to do some advocacy on your own behalf. You have to do some diplomacy. You always have to remember that you are a guest in everybody's country, and you always have to follow the laws, all of them. You don't get to choose. So it was an interesting time, but it would be wrong for me to claim that the time that I inherited the group was more interesting than others. It was our time, and you have to play the challenges that you had in front of you.
Yeah, definitely. Is there anything that you learned that you would have done differently during your time there?
Oh gosh, lots of things I do differently. Anything. Look back at anything. Would I do things differently? Are you asking with respect to the geopolitical stuff, or
just kind of overarching? I'm thinking back to when we talked a few weeks ago, and you were telling me how everybody kind of remembers where they were at different times of their career, and you remember when the sanctions came down in your career. And you kind of got a little bit into that, and how you guys reacted, and I thought that was really interesting, and there were some good lessons in that. Yeah,
sure. So, the deferred prosecution agreement that we managed to get ourselves into for an organization like HSBC was a deeply traumatic experience. Hugely embarrassing for us. At the time, I do remember, you're right, your recollection of our earlier conversation is accurate. I do remember where I was when I heard that we were being fined that massive amount and we were having this DPA. And at the time, I just thought everybody on the planet was looking at us. Now, that was naive. Most people couldn't care less about HSBC. My family cared, and they were calling me up saying, what are you doing? What is going on? But I do remember it. It was a searing experience for us, and there were loads of lessons to learn from that. And I'll speak to the pieces of the business that I was responsible for at the time. I was responsible for the retail business, and in that moment of trauma, I think is the right word, or shock or embarrassment, we kind of sprung into action. We stood up programs of work, we mobilized resources. And when I look back at that, we would have been better off not mobilizing anything for a few months. We got ourselves into that situation because we didn't understand the discipline of managing financial crime risk to the standards that the regulators required. And the day after the DPA, we still didn't understand it properly. We just knew we'd been punished. And I think if I could have my time again in my role, which was just a small piece of the group at the time, well, a big piece, I guess, but a piece of the group, I would have slowed it down. I would have slowed the response down. I would have taken us all back to school. I would have done some learning around the risk management disciplines we needed before we started to try and put these things into action and before we tried to put them into a program. So things like that. And I think they're useful lessons to learn, because when you are in that moment of crisis, the tendency is to do something. And there will be occasions when actually action isn't the right thing. Sometimes you need to pause and you need to give yourself a bit of time, a bit of time to plug the skills gap. If you end up with a problem, it's normally because somebody didn't know something they should have known, and that knowledge, that skills base, often doesn't come quickly. So lots of little things like that I would have done differently.
Yeah, no, that makes a lot of sense. It's something we've hit on in class kind of this semester, to kind of take time to think and not to just jump into action. I think that's a good story that kind of replicates that. And
it's what I can tell you is it's in a calm conversation like this, it's the easiest thing in the world to say, and in the moment it's really hard. But I think starting to give yourselves permission to know it's hard, start to look for those opportunities when you might need to just stand back a little bit. It's important because it can make a big difference.
That makes sense. Let's move over to company culture. That's one of the main pillars of the Reuben Mark Initiative, and your push for people-centric culture at HSBC was kind of a departure from the normal in banking. Why is an employee's first culture important to you? Was there anything specific that happened in your career that made you think organizational character was important?
Yeah, it's a good question. I don't know whether there wasn't a specific moment. I mean, I have come to believe that a leader's most profound responsibility is to create the right environment, the best possible environment for the people that you're leading to be at their best and to fulfill their potential. And it's I've now got grown-up kids. It's a little bit like, there's an unspoken rule about parenting, which is that all parents try and give their kids the best possible start in life. And there's no manual for it, but we're all trying. We all have our own methods and our own formulas, and the results will be what they will be. I think if you have the privilege of leading other human beings, and remember, as a leader, you don't lead anything else. You don't lead money or capital or fixed assets or inventory, you just lead other human beings. I liked to kind of think of leadership's responsibilities through that lens. You've got to create the right environment for people to be at their best. So I've come to believe that through my career, and even with new adventures, I still think that's the best way to think about the role of leaders. I guess the other thing that I came to learn when I was running the retail business was, when leaders communicate with people in an organization, if you do, and maybe you can do this as part of your studies, analyze leadership communication, because I think 90% of it is just wasted. 90% of it is leaders hiding behind, I'm going to be a bit blunt here, but hiding behind PowerPoint slides and data, and not connecting with the people that they're leading in a human way. And I'll illustrate with an example. When I was running the retail business, I had to learn how to connect with 85,000 people in the retail branches and the retail networks. And that was a new skill for me. What I discovered was, I would do my regular town halls and my presentations, and and the recognition events. And I could talk about the business for a while, and then I'd open up to Q&A. And during the Q&A, if somebody asked a question that allowed me to reveal something about the human side of myself, that allowed me to share something, that allowed me to perhaps open up a moment of weakness or doubt or even vulnerability, the energy in the room changed. People were really listening. All right. So what I discovered was people being led, a craving a human connection from leadership. And I just put those things together and decided, look, this is what my organization would benefit from too. So I tried, and it was a fantastic experience, actually. You know, when
I
you
imagine it's a harder goal to kind of come from that perspective than just like a hard numbers and facts and targets, right? I mean, if you come out and say, I want to have this people first culture, and if somebody isn't happy with that, they're going to John Flint and saying, hey, John, I'm not too happy with this, right?
Yeah, so it's really interesting. So, of course, I did both. So I had a strategy. So the hard side of strategy, how are we going to deploy our capital? Where are we going to compete? What are our metrics, etc.? You have to have all of that. But I also had this ambition inside HSBC. My ambition was for us together to build the healthiest human system in financial services. And we started to talk about the energy of the firm and the culture of the firm in that context. And, you know, I was not in the chief executive role for particularly long, but whilst I was there, you know, the financial returns moved in the right direction. Revenues grew, profits grew, the returns on equity went up from 6.8% the year before I was chief exec. They were 11.2 at the half year when I eventually stepped down. Customer engagement was up. No one remembers any of that, which slightly frustrates me a little. What they do remember is what we tried to do with respect to the human side of life at work inside HSBC. They remember the experiment of the healthiest human system. So I think that tells you something about people's appetite and what they were looking for.
It does. So let's move to more of the industry as a whole. So we have a number of future investment bankers on the call today, some ex-investment bankers. And I will say that this was an extremely hot topic in our advanced organizational change class. So culture has been a huge talking point for banks for a number of years. What do you think banks are getting right now? What do you think they're getting wrong? How do you see it evolving? And honestly, is it even realistic to expect culture to get to the place where people think it can get when it's a client services business at the end of the day?
Yeah, so the answer to your great question, the answer to your question probably will lay in the hands of the clients, and I'll come back to that. The culture of banking has got better post GFC, no question. We've got a much better sense now for the role we play in society and how we need to treat customers. So I think that there's been a huge step up there. There are still aspects of culture in banking where I think, candidly, we're getting it wrong. You know, the one that bugs me the most, I think, or the one that I find the most frustrating is particularly with respect to investment banking, is this perpetual habit of working the juniors unfairly hard, right? I don't understand why you would go out into the world and try and find the best and brightest minds you can, and then create the worst possible conditions for them to be at their best. And you know, find me a biologist, a neuroscientist, a psychologist who tells you, who is prepared to say that people are at their best when they're sleep deprived. You know, that's kind of the model for too many firms, and I think it's dull. Now, I absolutely get that the economic model works. For every one person in an investment bank, there are 1,000 people who would love their job, and we know that, and so we can sustain the current working practices. But I just wonder whether we could do it better, and I'm waiting for one of the major players to put their hand up and say, actually, we can do better than this. Let's research this. Let's experiment for a while. Let's see if we can get better productivity with better working practices. If we can create, lower turnover. Let's see if we can get, better productivity out of these brilliant minds that we're hiring. Now, it would take a leader to step up and say, I'm going to break the norms of the last 60 years. And so far, I'm a little disappointed no one has. And therefore, I suspect the answer might lay in the hands of the clients.
Okay.
And the next time, whenever a young person in an investment bank has a problem, a health problem, a mental health problem, and it reaches the media, the bank gets vilified. I think the next time it happens, we need to see which client was being serviced by that person who went over the edge.
It's a really interesting thought, especially in today's day and age with ESG. I know a lot of the, buy side firms, and a lot of the people have come out with, frameworks for their companies. You see them in all the board decks, but there's been less kind of focus put on the people, that they're hiring, to do their work on them. And that's definitely, something that sounds, ESG focused that you think is coming down the line.
I think so. I'm running a bank again, so I'm not in a position at the moment to be procuring, investment banking or advisory services. But if I was today, I'd want in the terms and conditions a commitment that the juniors working on the pitch or working on the transaction were going to get looked after during the week. So, yeah, it's one example. There's lots of other cultural examples. This is one that kind of reaches the media once or twice a year. I think there's a neat solution for somebody brave enough to step up and do it. Absent that, I suspect the pressure will come via the media and via clients eventually. But it would be a shame if we left it to the clients.
Makes a lot of sense. All right, let's jump over to your current role right now. So to give everybody a little background, the UK Infrastructure Bank was launched in June 2021. It's focused on increasing infrastructure investment across the UK, including tackling climate change and supporting regional and local economic growth. Has your leadership style changed at all since you've moved away from more of a traditional investment bank, or what's your thoughts on that?
So it's a tough question to answer, because I think good leaders should aspire to be contextual, right? So I'm always a bit nervous of leaders who have a playbook, who, irrespective of the conditions, irrespective of what they see in front of them, they do things the following way. This is what they do. I had the privilege of leading HSBC, a large, very complex global financial services firm in 67 countries and 250,000 people. I'm now building a government-sponsored niche investment banking startup in the UK with a single country focus. My learnings, my skills, my attributes as a leader haven't changed. But the context and the problem I'm trying to solve is fundamentally different. So I still care about the environment for the staff that I'm leading and the environment that I want to build as we build this startup. I will use everything I've learned in my previous career to make that successful. But the nature of my role is just so dramatically different, because the challenge in front of me is dramatically different. But me as a leader, those attributes, that philosophy towards that duty of care towards the people that I'm leading, that won't change. It doesn't matter what I do or where.
The toolbox is the same. You're just applying it to a different situation. That makes sense.
Exactly right.
So I know that there is a strategic plan coming out in June. Can you give us a little sneak peek and give us a little view under the hood into the UK Infrastructure Bank?
I can't give you a sneak peek, because I'm now a public servant, and we've got good processes around all of this. And when we have developed our strategy, we'll agree it with our shareholder, which is Her Majesty's Treasury, and then we will seek to publish it. But there shouldn't be any surprises for anybody, because the UK Infrastructure Bank is a new policy or development bank for the UK with a very narrow and very clear focus on helping the UK build the infrastructure required for net zero and or what we call leveling up, so accelerating regional and local economic growth away from the southeast in the UK. So the technologies that we're likely to be investing in, the industries, etc., are all reasonably clear. It'll be about clean energy. It will be about digital infrastructure. It will be about waste and transport and water. But people are going to have to wait until June to see exactly what the details are.
Makes sense. Love it. So we talked a lot about teams, culture. how did you kind of get that point across to other people in your organization about how important culture was? Was it kind of leading by example? Were there metrics that you'd put out in place? Because that's one thing that, we talk a lot about in class, is just that if you don't have somebody leading it from the top, it almost seems hard to change a culture from the bottom. So how did you kind of get everybody at the top management to do that?
Yeah. So I think the role of leadership is absolutely key. And I'm always a little bit skeptical about a kind of a programmatic approach to culture. And I've seen a lot of them. I can remember the names of lots of culture programs that we rolled out at HSBC. I don't remember them making much of a difference. But what I do remember are leaders making big decisions in those crucible moments and then telling the stories afterwards, and us continuing to tell the stories. So I think, culture's not built in theory. Culture's not built in, for want of a better phrase, peacetime. Culture's built in those defining moments. You hope that you've got leaders in place who will make the right decisions. And then, in the calm after the events, what you need to do is you need to get leaders on stage explaining why they made those decisions. And I was fortunate, I grew up in one organization that was rich with great characters, big decisions, great stories, and they informed everything about my approach to, towards the bank. There was one of my predecessors, Vanderlei Greyburn, during the Japanese occupation of Hong Kong during the Second World War, whilst most people were fleeing, chose to stay in Hong Kong to be with the bank. He didn't want to leave the bank. And he was interred in a Japanese prison camp in Hong Kong, and he died in the conditions there. So one of my, and those stories are important to me because that told me how the chief executive or the chairman of the bank at the time thought about their role, how they thought about the sense of responsibility they had to the organization. There's another great story coming out of the war where the Japanese forced the bank to issue duress notes, so notes that were issued kind of at gunpoint, and these were in circulation in the community in Hong Kong. And after the war, the management of the bank decided to honor those notes because they had our name on it. So decisions like that, with stories attached and a history attached, I think they are incredibly powerful. And the best organizations curate their own history and celebrate their own history. And I won't go into it now for time's sake, but they should also curate those moments where they get it wrong too. And for us, the story around the DPA and the traumas around that, those stories should be curated as well. Because you can learn an enormous amount from them. Yeah,
that makes a lot of sense. So we're going to move over to some Q&A here. We have a question here. Do you ever change up? Do you keep 100% of kind of your leadership style depending on who you're talking to, or do you kind of tailor that towards the person or the situation at hand?
Oh, so communication style, you've got to learn to change it up, right? I mean, you've got to learn. If you end up leading a large organization, on the one moment you can be speaking to a president or a prime minister of a country, and or the governor of a central bank, and the next you can be in a branch dealing with clerical staff who are doing clerical duties, or in a contact center dealing with people answering phone calls. And you need to be able to adjust your communication style to fit your audience. So I don't think your leadership style changes, but how you communicate does. And I think over time, you just need to enjoy the process of building those skills. Don't get stressed by it. It's an amazing opportunity to learn to do those things. And the best leaders do. The best leaders that I've observed are comfortable in any forum with any audience. So yeah, if it's a skill that you recognize you don't have now, don't worry. You just need to get it.
Makes sense. All right, another one from the audience. We're going to take a hard left turn and we're going to do global inflation. What are your thoughts and expectations of global inflation and impacting the economy in the short term? How do you expect fiscal and monetary policy to adjust across the globe to this?
So absent a shock from either Russia or China, absent a Ukrainian invasion or some such follow-up. I do think this inflation peak is going to be reasonably sharp but transitory. I think monetary policy will continue to respond probably through the first half of this year, and then I think we will probably be done. There are other deflationary forces now at work in many of the developed parts of the world, so we have to get through this little period. I think the central banks are a bit behind now, but not much. And I do think that as we come out the other half of the summer, or the second half of the summer, I think a lot of these inflationary pressures will look to be waning. But for now, inflation's real. It is eating away at people's disposable income. Central banks have got a little bit more to do, but I don't think we're at the start of a secular shift here in inflation expectations.
So another question. So we talked a little about this earlier with your time there, but more in general, with some of the tensions in Hong Kong and global politically, do you think that Hong Kong is going to retain its status as one of Asia's financial hubs?
Yes, I do, because Hong Kong is still the obvious gateway to China. It's still the obvious entry point for China's for the Chinese economy if you're coming at it from outside of China. There's always the potential that Hong Kong could be displaced from within China, but I think for now, Hong Kong still has an awful lot of ground to lose and enjoys still a lot of advantages. So it's been a tough couple of years, I think, for Hong Kong, particularly with the pandemic. But I wouldn't bet against the people of Hong Kong. I wouldn't bet against Hong Kong. It's got an amazing work ethic, amazing attitude towards work, an amazing appetite for work and for commercial risk taking. And in the context of Hong Kong's reasonably, even in the modern history of Hong Kong, the last couple of years, it's a reasonably minor speed bump, actually. So I think Hong Kong's still got an awful lot to look forward to.
Makes a lot of sense. We only have a few minutes here. I know you're very busy, but is there anything that you wish you knew before starting your career? I know that's a big, broad bucket, but is there something that you can put your finger on that you wish you could go back and tell yourself?
Yeah, well, we've already alluded to it. I do remember when I was a junior officer in the bank, my first year, somebody very senior did say to me, John, you need to think of your career as a game of snakes and ladders, i.e., you like to think it's just going to be one continual movement from ladder to ladder, but it won't be. You will occasionally hit a snake. And I do remember that conversation, but I didn't really understand it properly. And I think that it's that thing that if you have a 30, 40-year career, or if you have several 10-year careers in your lifetime, there are going to be moments of setback. There are going to be the occasional snake, and you need to try and embrace that when it happens, because in my experience, these things tend to have delivered more value than harm. So I was told it, but I didn't internalize it. I guess I was too young to kind of have the wisdom to understand what I was being told. But if I had the opportunity now to spend time with people at the start of their career and get them to see it, I think that would be the one that I would spend time on.
Makes a lot of sense. Well, some of you guys know me on this call right now. I could spend all day with John, but that is unfortunately all the time that we're going to be able to take from you today. John, thank you so much for joining us, and best of luck in the new role.
Leland, thank you very much for hosting the conversation. It's been great fun. And yeah, please do stay in touch. If people have more questions post-event, you know how to get hold of me. If I can be helpful, I will.
Fantastic. We'll see you. Thanks again.
Thank you.